I'm really excited about this event because we have three amazing panelists. We have Sharon Nazarian, who has woken up really early. It's 6 o'clock right now in Los Angeles. Sharon is the Vice President of International Affairs for Anti-Defamation League. And we also have Hamid Sabi, who is, I think, in about 4 or 5 kilometers from where I am in London. Hamid is a prominent lawyer and activist, and many people may have recently heard about Hamid's activities during the Aban trial, which was held in London in, when was it, last November, November 2021. And we also have another early riser, George Haroonian, who is a prominent Jewish American and activist and a great friend of IranWire. Whenever I have a question about Iranian Jews, the history of Jews in Iran, and anything that has to do with the Jewish community in Iran, I ask Jews, and he's been very helpful to us. But I would like to ask Hamid the first question. So anti-Semitism is not something that's unique to Iran, and it's not something that's unique to the Islamic Republic. We've had anti-Semitism for a very long time in Iran. And I remember a conversation that I had with late Dariush Humayun, who, as you remember, the prominent journalist who was also a minister in the Shah's government. And Dariush Humayun, he joined an organization called Sumka in the 1940s, and Sumka was basically a neo-Nazi party modeled after the Nazi party in Germany. And Dariush was telling me that during that time, most, if not all, but of course, except maybe for the two-day party, most of the parties were anti-Semitic in the 1940s. But of course, the situation improved in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when Jews were integrated in the Iranian society. But I remember in the 70s as a kid, I loved to watch, like many other people, Fiddler on the Roof. And someone told me that, have you read the Protocols of Elders of Zion? So my question for Hamid is that how much of the anti-Semitism after the revolution and in the Islamic Republic has its roots in the anti-Semitism in Iran before the revolution?
Thank you. As you said, the anti-Semitism had been with Jews since Jews started going to diaspora. So it goes back from the time that Jews migrated out of Israel or Judea, as it was at the time. In Iran, of course, during the Reza Shah's time, when the relation with Germany became very close, anti-Semitism and racist ideas became a dominant force in Iran. And Professor Ansari had written in his book very clearly about the concept of anti-Semitism, and the majority of the people in power in Iran were either German educated or pro-Hitler or pro-Nazis, and the feeling was running high. And as you mentioned, Sumka was one of the main forces that they would come with the brown shirts and dagger in their side, and they attacked Jews, and they attacked, of course, other liberal groups as well. But when we came to the revolution, I think the anti-Semitism became more in the form of anti-Zionist expression, underneath being anti-Semitism, but the cover for it was anti-Zionist, and the expressions of anti-Zionism in Iran was basically representing the anti-Semitism that was in the ruling class. So the state more or less propagated and confirmed and celebrated any anti-Zionist movement, including anti-Semitism that comes with it. You could see that for instance, anybody who was connected to Israel, only if they were Jews, they were under attack. Now, the leader himself and Hashemi Rafsanjani and the others sat with Mossad and agreed to get arms from them, but that was not considered to be anything wrong with it. But if Mr. El-Ghanian went to Israel, that was a major crime and carried a capital punishment with it. So it is a coverage, anti-Zionism is a coverage in Iran for the existing regime for anti-Semitism that has been embedded in the mentality of the religious groups, especially that wing of Shiism that was represented by Khomeini.
Was this anti-Semitism that you're talking about and anti-Zionism unique to Islamic activists, or was it also prevalent among the leftist, socialist, nationalist, and other groups?
No, what was expressed by the Islamic groups was not the way that the liberals in the left and liberals in Europe use as anti-Zionism. For instance, I mentioned in one of the interviews with you guys that when we went to see Bazargan for the first time as representatives of the Jewish community, with the late Dr. Danishrat being the leader, we went to see Bazargan, and the discussion naturally moved to the Zionism, and Mr. Danishrat asked Bazargan that they should not mix the Jews' belief that they go back to Zion, which is respected and sanctified in Judaism, with the Zionism, which is a political movement. And Bazargan expressed a complete, total surprise. He says, I thought Zion is the name of the founder of the Zionism. So the ignorance, I think he's a man that he was fighting for Palestinians all his life, but he still didn't know anything about Zionism and just hated something that he didn't know. Certainly underneath it is anti-Semitism. He hates it because he hates Zionism because it's representing Jews, not because the state of Israel is something that he opposes. So it is very deep in the system, but it manifests itself as anti-Zionism.
And it's also interesting, because you mentioned Mr. Danishrat, who was member of, he was one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Iran, but also he was a member of Tudeh party. And he was, he came with you to the meeting with Mr. Bazargan. How much do you think that the anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes that are propagated in Iran now have roots in the leftist propaganda, especially coming from Tudeh party, who was at some point a Stalinist party?
Well, I think Tudeh party was the only party at the time, back in 1940s and 50s, that welcomed Jews. And Jews, including members of my family, moved to the party willingly because that's where they could express themselves as equals.
Like communist parties all around the world, yeah.
It wasn't the same in other political movements, even during the national government, where there were more liberal views about communists and also the other groups, and they could easily form political parties. Still, Jews were not that welcome. So I think Communist Party at least was more hospitable to Jews than the other political groups.
Okay. So Sharon, as Vice President of International Affairs for ADL, you travel into different places around the world and you talk to different leaders of Jewish community. How much do you think the anti-Semitism in Iran have in common with other sorts of anti-Semitism in different parts of the world. Can we call the anti-Semitism that propagated by the Islamic Republic a uniquely Iranian or Islamic Republic phenomenon, or it has commonality with other forms of anti-Semitism in different parts of the world, especially the countries in the Middle East?
First of all, Maziar, I want to thank you and IranWire for having this very important conversation for your audience. So I really appreciate being welcomed onto your platform, and thank you for all the good work that IranWire does. As for your question, Iran is unique and similar in many ways. So I would say that when it comes to using anti-Semitic tropes, classic accusations that are misinformed, that are ignorant, or intentionally vilifying of Jews, Iran uses very similar rhetoric, the Islamic Republic, similar rhetoric as you would find in the rest of the Middle East, or as for that matter, the rest of the world. But what is unique about Iran, Maziar, I would contend, and I think my colleagues would agree, as far as ADL is concerned, we consider Iran the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial today in the world. So there's no other government that on its official channels, in its public statements, without any hesitation, uses classic anti-Semitism to vilify Jews, to vilify Israel, and to literally deny the Holocaust. And that is unique today. So I would say that as far as ADL is concerned, one of the reasons that we focus so much on Iran, besides the fact that I'm Iranian and the position I am, I hope to bring a lot more education and awareness about the regime, its threats, but the way it propagates its rhetoric, which is hate-filled, and is, as we all know, it's not just about the Jews, but about other minorities as well, about the Baha'is. We do see it as a unique feature because it's built into the very DNA of the regime. And whether it's about Israel and the right of Jews to have self-determination, whether Israel should even exist, we've heard Iranian leaders talk about kind of destroying and throwing the Jews out into the sea. We've seen the regime hold Holocaust-denying cartoon contests on an annual basis, where they invite cartoon artists from around the world to submit their cartoons that essentially deny or question the Holocaust. I mean, this you don't just see in any other government around the world. And I can tell you that, as we say, anti-Semitism today, unfortunately, is on the rise. My #1 focus is in Europe. And in Europe, what you see is this kind of perfect storm of right-wing nationalism on the rise. You see also the kind of left-wing anti-Semitism that we saw in Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, as you've well documented, kind of this very Stalinist, anti-Western, anti-capitalist ideology that also embraces anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And then you also see the Islamist extremism. So all this coming together in Europe really makes it the perfect storm, and therefore, a huge concern to us at ADL. But Iran still is unique in that it is the main exporter of anti-Semitic rhetoric, of Holocaust-denying ideas and ideology, and pushes it through its proxies. Hezbollah, Hamas, they use that same language. You see the Houthis in Yemen. Iran also has this amazing machinery of platforms in multiple languages. Hispan TV is purely, Iranian government propaganda in Spanish spread through the Latin American and Spanish-speaking world. So it's not one that keeps its rhetoric to itself. Unfortunately, it has this machinery that pushes it across the world, and we see that rhetoric, in Latin American countries. The same language, the same hateful rhetoric show up in Brazil, in Argentina, in parts of the world that you would be surprised. So it goes beyond Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, where you would imagine to find that rhetoric. You find it literally across the world.
How much people are aware of that in different parts of the world? When you travel to different countries and you talk to different leaders, whether leaders of the Jewish communities or political leaders in different countries, and when they know that you are an Iranian Jew, how much people are aware of this propaganda that is created by the Iranian government in different languages in different parts of the world?
The Jewish communities are very aware. The Iranian regime really presents an existential threat to most Jews around the world. And I think we, all of us sitting in the diaspora, are well aware of not only our own physical security. I have to tell you, this regime's finger, they reach very far, and they're notorious for, committing acts of violence and murder against opposition figures. So this is not a regime that just sits quietly and uses just its public channels to send rhetoric out. It commits acts of violence against anyone within Iran and outside Iran to silence in any way necessary. We saw now with Masih Ali-Nejad, who is one of probably the biggest thorns in the side of this regime now, as an activist who really fights against a compulsory hijab. There was a whole scheme to kidnap her from New York and bring her back to Iran. So we understand, Jews around the world understand the threat of this regime and what it's willing to do. The fact that it uses other languages, the fact that it's hateful rhetoric, it is so systematic. I'm not sure other governments are aware of, and that's part of my job. When I do my diplomatic missions, when I meet with foreign ministers and ambassadors, that is my number one point, to say, you need to be aware what this regime is trying to do, including in the US, including in Washington, DC, and in the halls of Congress, because there are those voices in our own government here in the US who are not fully aware of the proxies of those who are pushing an agenda. And it takes very sophisticated form. One is of appeasement. One is of, let's talk about, to talk to the moderates versus the radicals. So we have to be more aware of what this regime is capable of.
Yeah. So speaking of violence and the impact on the Iranian Jewish community, George, what can you tell us about the impact of this kind of the new kind of anti-Semitic propaganda and anti-Israeli propaganda on the Jewish community itself? Many of our viewers may not know that there is a vibrant Jewish community in Iran. Can you tell us a little bit about Jewish community in Iran and the impact of the revolution and the new form of anti-Semitism on the Jewish community?
First, I want to commend you personally and IranWire for hosting this program. As far as I know, you are the only medium in the Iranian community that is doing this work. And as an Iranian Jew, I want to thank you for covering this issue. Addressing the issues that you have raised and specifically asked from me, I want to not to discount an issue that I think was hopped over, and that is the depth and history of anti-Semitism in Iran. Although we talk about denial of Holocaust, we should not do denial of anti-Semitism in Iran. Shiite based ideology has a deep concept of Jews being under Muslims. And I want to point this fact about anti-Semitism.
I guess you mean certain interpretation of Shiism, not
maybe
all.
then if you want to go that
certain interpretation of Shias regard Jews.
Well, I mean, famous, well-known Shiite clerics, the issue of Jaziyah, the issue of them choosing between becoming a Muslim or paying this special tax. These were all discussed in fatwas throughout history. But
no, I'm just trying to avoid any kind of generalization, because there are many prominent Shia clerics and reformers who don't believe in this. But yeah, sorry.
Well, we'll see. But I mean, there is a distinction. There is quite a difference between Christian-based anti-Semitism and Islamic-based anti-Semitism. And going back, and Muhammad fought the Jews, but Christians wanted Jews. They thought of Jews as conspirators and so on, and as what you see throughout the centuries. But back to the Iranian Jewish community. I believe Iranian Jews what I learned from my father, grandparents, grandmothers, all, was that Iranian Jews developed a psyche to avoid confrontation with Islamic leaders or with the government. They went on the side, majority. And of course, in the mid-20th century, there was, as we discussed, differences, different situations arose. Jews became more educated, entered the more economic activity. Some became very successful, so on and so forth. But your question was about the impact of the revolution to the Iranian Jews. So I would like to say this, that having this psyche, having this idea that when there is a talk about an Islamic government, it is not our place. We cannot live with people who our grandparents told us how they treated them when they were walking in the streets in Isfahan and it was raining. So that immediately, of course, caused a large number of Jews, particularly after the execution of the late Mr. Elghanian, Ebi Baruchim, Daniel Pur, all these people, a large segment of Iranian Jews, and I would say the more affluent section of the community, took what they could take and left Iran.
What is the size of the Iranian Jewish community now?
Is estimated by the officials of the community to be about 20,000.
And it was about 80,000 before the revolution.
85,000 before revolution. But I always ask this because in Israel, they say the Iranian Israeli community is about 250,000. And let's say most of these are third generation, fourth generation, let's say. So Iran had a large Jewish community, but there was no official statistics. So I would say probably in the 50s, even the numbers were as high as this because many immigrated in that in
the 40s and 50s.
Even some in the early 20th century. But back to the revolution issue, then another large section of Iranian Jews left Iran when the Iran-Iraq war started. Obviously, didn't want their children to die in the war or because of security situation. So another section left in that period, and many went to Israel and again to Europe and the United States. And we had other waves. There was a idea that when the 13 Jews of what we call Shiraz 13 were accused of being spies of Israel and United States, these caused a scare. And a lot of people said, wow, if they can accuse anybody this kind of accusations, I'm not going to stay here. So probably another wave left in that period. So I would say 75 to 80% of the Iranian Jewish community has left Iran, but many have stayed because of various reasons. Maybe one reason is that...
Let's get to the Iranian Jewish community right now. While we are talking about the persecution of Jews in the beginning of the revolution, I want to ask Hamid, who was there actually during the revolution in Iran, and you remember the time that they executed Hamid Elghanian, the prominent Jewish leader of the Jewish community in Iran. Can you tell us about and you called it in a recent interview with IranWire that it was a watershed moment. Could you tell us about the moment that you heard about the execution of Mr. Elghanian, how it affected you personally, and also how did it impact the Jewish community in Iran in general?
Yeah, Hamid Elghanian was really a very popular personality in Iran, apart from being the head of the community sense. But he was really charitable and benevolent. There wasn't a cause that you call upon him and he wouldn't come and support that cause. There wasn't a poor family that went to his office to get help and he didn't respond to it. So for years and years, he and his brother, David Haroonian, had held the community on very quiet and never boasted about it. Not many people knew how many people they had helped. So it wasn't his position as head of the community, but it was a person who had reached every aspect of the community, every person there who had wanted to send a child to go to hospital somewhere, he would pay for it. Somebody wanted to send his son to get educated, they helped. Somebody got the divorce, didn't have money, he helped. So it was so wide. I did not know as much as until he was executed. When I begged of him not to come back to Iran, because during the revolution, he was out of Iran and he was part of a committee that I was a member to. Personally, I really pleaded with him not to come back. But he did come back, and when everybody challenged him, he said, what can they do to me? I'm an old man, my wife has died, I don't want to live abroad. And if I'm here, the community feels more comfortable. So when he came back, we were all worried about him, and then he got arrested. So immediately upon his arrest, we thought that this is going to be a very serious problem. A letter was written at our request by Hamid Sabi, very nicely supporting him, what he has done for the community, all his support. We took it to Ayatollah Talabani. He wrote a note on it to Mr. Zavari, who was the head of the prison. And I went there with Dr. Burukhim, who's now in Los Angeles. Both of us went there and tried to go and see Mr. Zavari. We were refused. They asked for the letter. We didn't give it to them. Eventually, they arrested Dr. Burukhim for a few hours, and when he came back, he says, there isn't any hope. They're going to execute him. We made a delegation, and the next day we went to see Ayatollah Khani, who was the head of the Central Committee. We said, look, we are not pleading anymore for him. We are pleading for the Islamic Republic. If you execute it, the whole world would rise against you. The Islamic Republic will be condemned as killing the head of the community, will be considered a main anti-Zionist, anti-Semite, all these things. And Khani was very much in support of us. He tried.
This is Mahdavi Khani, who recently passed away.
At that time, he was the head of
the committees,
committee who was in Baharistan. He tried to call Khomeini at home. They said he's asleep. And later on,
So Mahdavi Khani was sympathetic to your plea.
He was sympathetic to the fact that this will damage the newly established Islamic Republic badly by killing the head of the Jewish community there, or former Jewish community, it didn't matter. So he tried, and eventually Khomeini had called back. We didn't know we were gone by that time, and told him that Islamic justice should be carried out, which means death sentence. So the day before he was executed, we knew that he would be executed. But it was a terrible day, and for me it was personally very bad, because after he was executed, there was a real problem in the community, especially in Maziar. They came with, they said, we congratulate you for getting rid of such an evil person and bringing sweets and offerings to the Jewish Bazaris, which was terrible, terrible acts of anti-Semitism there. So we tried to calm the community, and we said we go to the synagogues and say, cool down, we'll try to go and see Khomeini, which we managed to see Khomeini on Monday after that. I didn't go there, and in one of the synagogues that I went to, and that I never forget that scene, because I was then accused of being responsible for his death. Says, you guys supported this. We never supported it. But and that was very, very harsh for me. And I always remember that in connection with late Hamid Sabi. It was a watershed because
the charges. He was charged of being a Zionist and helping Israel.
yes, because he had contributed, like all of us have done this. It's part of the psyche, culture. You collect money for Israel, you collect money for this cause, for that cause. You don't find a Jewish family that has not supported one way or another something in Israel or the state of Israel itself. So he being a prominent member of the society, of course he had help. But that wasn't really the point. Khomeini was deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And Ayatollah Talabani had warned us very much in advance of him coming to Iran that be very careful. That unless you move forward and show something, Khomeini is anti-Semitic. And he would, if it's possible, destroy the whole community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it led to forming the Iranian Jewish intellectuals, which was basically something that Ayatollah Talabani had demanded from us to make and create an organization that supports the movement.
So the death of Mr. Haroonian really impacted the Jewish community and maybe provoked many of the Jewish Iranians to migrate from Iran.
It was the main cause for migration.
Hmm.
And although Khomeini on the Monday after that said Jews and Zionists should not be mixed, but this wasn't. So the
No one
community,
believed him, really. Many people didn't believe him. Yeah. So Sharon, you travel to different countries, and we've seen also a migration of Jews from different countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. What do you think happens to these countries, the nations, when Jews migrate, when they are losing a large population, some of them many talented citizens of these countries? What happens not only to the Jewish communities in those countries, but to the countries in general? And what can you tell us about what has happened to Iran, not only to the Jewish community in Iran, to Iran as a nation?
First of all, broadly speaking, Maziar, what we contend is that anti-Semitism, in a way, is a canary in the coal mine. Any society where Jews are persecuted and Jews flee is a very clear sign that that society is unhealthy for all its citizens. So anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is clearly a reflection of a society that is either slipping back, if it's a democracy. We see that in Hungary, we see that in other parts of the world, where democratic societies, once anti-Semitism and incidents of anti-Semitic acts go, and an increase, what we know is that those democracies are unhealthy and having a backward slide. In undemocratic societies as well, we know that once Jews are targeted for whatever purpose that is, other minorities and the very citizens of those countries are no longer safe. So it's a very important contention for us to hold that it is an issue that all societies need to care about and is a very important indicator of where governments and countries are headed once you see a rise in anti-Semitism. And that's why the focus in Europe is so great right now, because we see that, and in the US for that matter as well. So that's one issue that we have to keep in mind and remember that this is not a Jewish problem. It is a problem for all of us to contend with. Time and time again, in many countries, we've seen when Jews have been targeted, the next in line would be other minorities and therefore opposition groups. And then therefore, so that factually has been very clearly established that the anti-Semitism is an indicator of other intolerances. I would also say that, when we look around the world today, whether it's in Middle East, it's in Europe, it's in Latin America, the anxieties that societies are facing today, whether it's economic, whether it's xenophobia, fear of the others coming in, through mass migrations, whether it's the role of social media, which has become really the mouthpiece in this kind of enabler of ideologies that have always been there, right? Anti-Semitic ideologies, hateful ideologies have always been part of society. But what social media is now enabling is not only the scale and exploration of these ideologies to mass amounts of people, but also allowing it to be done in a way that you don't, before, you know, the KKK had to wear masks and as they marched through the streets, or neo-Nazi groups. Today, you hide behind your computer if you're an extremist, if you're hateful, and you're protected. So what is enabled through social media today is these hateful ideologies have always been there, getting now spread through the world and to a scale that is just unprecedented. So when it comes to Jewish communities, we know that ideology that is found on social media today doesn't stay on social media. Ideology that is verbalized doesn't stay as just a verbal statement, but actually turns into acts of violence. And we saw it even in last May when Israel had another conflict with Hamas. We saw the attacks on Israel as a state and Jews who believed in the state of Israel turned into actual acts of violence perpetrated against Jews in the US, in New York, in Los Angeles, in London, in Berlin. And so that connection is also very important. And again, Jewish communities realize that, understand it, and part of my advocacy and ADL's work is really making governments aware that not only do we have to fight the social media companies who are allowing such rhetoric, just like any product, you know, if you're using a medicine bottle or if you're sitting in your car, you have a car seat, you have the bottle cap. Social media companies also have to be held to the safety of their users. And so we at ADL, a lot of our advocacy has to do with protecting the users and assuring their safety. And we as Jews are very much, you know, in a position of vulnerability because we see that kind of hate, you know, turned against us. And as we already established, you know, the Islamic Republic uses those social media tools and platforms in a very effective way. And it affects Jews everywhere. No matter where Jews sit today, they see the regime as a threat to their daily lives. Maziar, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Do you know of any studies about the impact of persecution of Jews and anti-Semitism on a country's wealth and well-being? Like what happened to Egypt, for example, after the persecution of Jews by the Nasser government? What happened to Iraq? What changed really in terms of the more tangible maybe Sharon, you can answer, or any of you who have
I forgot that part of your question. Yes, that's obviously that's a very important factor. And you know, you have the two amazing panelists here, both Mr. Haroonian and Mr. Sabi can contest to the fact that countries that lose their minorities, and Jews being at the helm of that, really, it's not only just a matter of brain drain, not a matter of losing the most vibrant part of your communities. It also is a message to those who do remain. And we hear time and time again, whether it's in Iran, today we hear obviously in Egypt and in Syria and Iraq, countries that had vibrant Jewish communities who now are really without that. And so the value, actually to do a calculation, financial value, of what Jewish communities had brought and no longer bring to those societies. It would be an amazing PhD dissertation to really do a calculation, the financial calculation of the losses to those societies. So Iraq today, Syria, Lebanon, these countries where have had vibrant Jewish communities, it is not just an intellectual loss. It is a cultural loss, it is a financial loss, and it's a message to the population who remain that, if you could leave, the most vibrant part of your community is left. And therefore, this is not a society where productive citizens want to remain. And you can see now from both in Europe and the US, what just the Iranian diaspora has brought to their new homelands, whether again in Europe, throughout Europe or in the US. Iranians are a very successful and respected immigrant community. And so all of that value, unfortunately, is lost to the Iran and to the other countries that Jews have left.
Yeah, I'm always thinking about all the Iranian doctors who live outside of Iran. Many Iranian Jewish doctors, Christians, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, who practice medicine in different parts of the world. They could be at the service of Iranian people right now, especially during the pandemic. So speaking of the people who remained, George, unlike Egypt, unlike Iraq or Yemen or Syria, many Iranian Jews, in your words, 20,000 Iranian Jews at least, they decided to stay in Iran. Why do you think the migration has not been even more massive despite the persecution? And can you also tell us about the daily life of Iranian Jews, despite in the midst of all the anti-Semitic propaganda, anti-Israeli propaganda, and all the hate?
Look, in the one TV debate that I had, the other person told me that you are not Iranian, you are affiliated with an enemy state. I told him, look, I am more Iranian than you. My people came to Iran 2,700 years ago, not 2,500, which is now 2,600, by the way. 2,700 years ago. Your people came 1,400, 1,300 years ago. So the answer is this. Jews and Iranians, we talk about this long history. If you look at Persian language and Hebrew, they have affected each other. You find Hebrew words that are Persian origin. You find Persian words that are Hebrew origin. These two cultures have mingled with each other for all these centuries. So the Iranian Jews who have stayed in Iran, naturally, that's their home. And I maintain that when this regime is over, I really think that Jews and Iranians will have a fantastic relationship again. And us Iranian-born Jews or Iranian Jews or Jewish Iranians, whatever you say, are the representation of that, let's call it, marriage. So why didn't they leave? That's the answer. But of course, as I was saying in the previous question, a lot of them talked to their brother or sister in Los Angeles, and the sister said, look, my daughter is not getting married, or my son is left the house when he was 21. So these traditional situations, some they say, okay, I have $200,000, I leave Iran. What I'm going to do in Los Angeles or New York, I'm going to lose all of it. But there are these issues. So I wanted to add something to you asked about doctors. I remember as a kid in reading in Kayhan or Etela'at that 10% of doctors in Tehran were Jews at a certain point, and were serving the Iranian the community in Tehran. So just imagine these doctors leaving Iran, besides all the entrepreneurs, all the people with international business connections, all those. So it was a net loss to Iran and a gain for United States, Israel, England, wherever they went. And I think that's enough said about the history of and then another thing I like to add is that many Iranian Jews understand, and many Iranians understand, they differentiate between the Islamists, the radical Islamists, let's put it in your way, and the regular Iranian people. I mean, I think at some point we need to discuss the two-side nature of the Iranian people.
At least two sides.
At least two sides, but one side hospitable, friendly, loving, welcoming, and the other side treating others as enemies. And that's Iranians, no matter what is their religion or their background, they know this.
So I know that you haven't lived in Iran for a long time, but when you talk to your friends and relatives in Iran, what's the daily life like for an Iranian Jew in the middle of all the anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli propaganda? How do they deal with it?
Look, I think Jews of Iran, like the rest of Iranians, they would leave if they could leave. I've talked to one prominent leader, I won't name his name. He said, if I could leave tomorrow, I would leave. Life in Iran is hard for everybody because of the economic situation, because of the regime brutality. So Jews, as I said, they go about their lives, they try to do their small business, do whatever they can to survive. Right now in Iran, there are Jews who are poor, they need help, so the community tries to help them. So there is all kinds of situations. But in general, if they could leave and be sure of a life on the other side, safe life, I think all Iranians are very much in that boat. So they are going about their lives and hoping for a better day to come as soon as possible.
And try to protect themselves as individuals, as a community.
Yeah, I can add very fast that, the parents are very concerned about anti-Israeli propaganda in schools, for school children. They teach them hatred of Israel and the Zionists, so-called Zionists, what they call, and they are concerned. The kid comes home and said, "Mom, they said this today about Israel. Isn't that where your cousin lives?" And they have to constantly deal with that issue.
Maziar, actually, I want to go a little bit deeper on the textbook issue, because we at ADL do a lot of assessments of textbooks throughout the Middle East. And my team just did a very in-depth assessment of Iranian textbooks. I think the most in-depth it's been done in decades. And just to give you some examples of not what Jewish students, but all students in Iran are exposed to. Not only teaching students to chant death to Israel, which has become so commonplace, but teaching students that Jews have conspired against Islam from its earliest days. They're forging Islamic scriptures, using warfare, that this is what's being said about Jews, teaching students that US-led sanctions against Iran today are part of a satanic plan. This is literally language that we picked out of textbooks today, that the sanctions are part of a satanic plan to eliminate Muslims, and that this was done by Jews. Teaching students that Iranian people, through their nuclear science in particular, have achieved the blessing with what they call with your great jihad and the blood of the youth. So what is being perpetrated by the regime is not only just an anti-Israel view, but is being taught to Iranian youth that Jews are satanic, that Jews are anti-Muslim and want to see the demise of Islam. And that's a really huge problem. I think what both Hamid and George would also contend is that the Jewish community in Iran is a captured community. Every day, they have to be concerned about whether they will be accused of espionage, of spying for whether it's Israel or for the US. They have to come out on the streets and participate in demonstrations that are anti-Israel. They have to. If not, they will be accused. So like other communities, like in Turkey and other countries around the world, the Jewish community of Iran today is between a rock and a hard place on a daily basis, have to walk a very fine line. And, they are being accused as being the other. The whole idea of dual loyalty, which is a very age-old anti-Semitic trope, is existent every single day. You are Jews, you are not Iranian. That is an anti-Semitic trope, where you are not accepted as a citizen of the very country you were born in. So these are realities that Jews in Iran still contend with, and these are leaders of our community you have on your the program today. Both Mr. Sabi and Mr. Haroonian work very hard in every way possible to protect the community, to take steps to ensure their safety, as we do at ADL. But it's a difficult challenge. It's a difficult one, I would have to admit.
Yeah. So Sharon, it's good that you talked about these Jewish tropes and stereotypes. Do you think that there are also certain unintentional tropes and stereotypes that people repeat, people who are not anti-Semitic, people who are not, do not hate Jews? For example, I'm thinking about the expression globalist, which has its roots in anti-Semitic propaganda, and at least in the Protocols of Elders of Zion, which is a fabricated anti-Semitic book that came out in Russia in the late 19th century. Do you think that there are some unintentional anti-Semitic tropes that people repeat?
What I would call that is anti-Semitism that's based in ignorance. So obviously, there's a lot that people don't know. And unintentionally, even in sometimes trying to, I mean, the globalist is a clearly anti-Semitic ideology. People might use that term, not understand this anti-Semitic connotation behind it, which is about the Jewish control of financial markets, of media, of the world. So that's where that term comes from. And that's where the connotation behind it is that Jews as a group have this overarching power over all these global institutions. But on the other side, you also have those who will say comments that might deem to be positive, but also kind of lean into and unfortunately give that sense that, you know, I've been in conversations where it's, well, you know, in Hollywood, Jews control Hollywood anyway. So that's such a great thing. You know, it must be so wonderful. I'm like, that is not true. And that's an anti-Semitic trope. Jews, you know, are so successful. We've done a lot of opinion surveys. And part of our survey questions is, do you think that Jews have too much financial power? And in some societies, that's not deemed as a negative. You know, they think that's a positive. Jews are productive. Jews are seen as good business people. So some of the even unintentional positive attributes to Jewish people winds up being used against us. So we have to be very careful. And I think a lot of the work that I do, that my team does, and I think also my colleagues do, is educating populations on our communities about how you can slip easily into using tropes. And believe me, today the examples are everywhere, from members of Congress to politicians. Many use tropes that unintentionally or sometimes intentionally, unfortunately, do fall into those stereotypes and using those tropes in a negative way.
But I guess accusations of anti-Semitism sometimes are used unintentionally or freely, and that can have negative consequences as well.
Absolutely.
That former Israeli ambassador called Harry Potter's actress Emma Watson an anti-Semite because she criticized the government of Israel.
Absolutely. And we have to be very careful. And we at ADL are very careful about using the label anti-Semitic. So we have to make sure that, of course, we don't know the intention of people. We're not in their heads, but we have to be very careful. And what we say often is these are anti-Semitic views, anti-Semitic sentiment, and we want to educate. So the first rule of thumb has to be about educating and talking about why some view that is expressed might be anti-Semitic. But what you're pointing to is really about allowing for free criticism of any government policy, including Israel's. And I can tell you that we at ADL have publicly criticized policies of the Israeli government in the past and today. But the difference is when you step over the line from criticism of policy to questioning the very existence of the state of Israel. So once you have those who really propagate and say, this is not anti-Semitic, actually it is, because what you're saying is if Israel has no right to exist and that the Jewish people are the only people who do not have a right to self-determination, that is anti-Semitic. So anti-Zionism, which at its core is about the fact that Israel has no right to exist, is anti-Semitic, and we at ADL contend that. But criticism of Israeli policy obviously has to be allowed. It's part of our free society, and there's no question about that.
Questioning the government of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Questioning the existence of Israel is anti-Semitic. So, Hamid, what do you think people in the diaspora, Jews and non-Jews, can do to help the situation in Iran and fight against anti-Semitic propaganda and try to, I'm not saying that they can help, but try to help the Jewish community in Iran and other Iranians?
As Sharon mentioned, I also believe that Jewish community in Iran the Persian Jewish community is a captive community. And it's not only the Persian Jewish community that is a captive, and it's not only Baha'is and minorities. The whole nation is a captive in the hands of these people. And in that sense, they're all very fragile. Jewish community is fragile, Baha'i is fragile. Therefore, when we approach the issues involving them, we should be very careful. For instance, I saw criticism of the head of the Central Committee appearing on the event that is called Ruz al-Quds, the Day of Jerusalem, where the regime every year organizes a massive demonstration, and by necessity, the head of the committee have to come and sit there. And that day, he was sitting there. He was sitting next to what's his name that was killed in January last year.
Soleimani.
He was asked. I mean, they placed him next to Qasem Soleimani. I don't think he had a choice. But then a flood of criticism goes for him sitting next to such a terrorist and on such a day. We have to be careful that these people would do whatever is asked from them. And I know that each one of them individually, they are not in any way anti-Israel or in any way trying, but they have to do things that are required for protection of their own community. Baha'is have to do things, Christians have to do things, I mean, they all have to play the tone that the totalitarian regime is asking them to.
And what can we do besides having these kind of webinars or publishing articles?
Criticize when they do acts that somebody compared the Jewish community to Judenrat in Germany, which is very unfair. And they are not
the collaborators.
They are just captive community that were doing what is required from them by a very violent and unforgiving state. They don't tolerate any criticism. So that's where I would like the media, especially. I mean, you've been very ahead of the others, but generally not to criticize the community when they seem to be compromising their standards and going out to the streets and calling death to Israel or whatever thing that they are forced to do. That is, first of all. But the youth in Iranian community, the new generation, you will be amazed to see how advanced they are. Hardly any racial or anti-Semitic feelings among them. They're very much advanced. They have read all these stories. They know what is anti-Semitism and they don't repeat this. While the older generation, although they are not anti-Semitic, they commit unintentional anti-Semitic remarks. But the younger generation are very much ahead of us, we can say. They're very, very well raised on these things, and they do understand very much what racism means, and they are not racist at all. I have a great hope in the younger generation in Iran, the ones that are fighting for freedom and democracy, and I think Jews will have a future with that community if they ever succeed.
Nice. So, George, do you share that optimism? And do you believe in the younger generation that they are more tolerant and open-minded than their parents?
Well, hope is ingrained in the Jewish psyche as well. That's why the national anthem of Israel is called Hope, Hatikva. Yes, I hope also for better days to come. I wanted to mention, Sharon brought it up properly, that never in history media, and in this case social media, have had such an impact in what's going on in the world. Hatred as well as understanding can travel very fast. I remember brought up the Gaza war of last year, when the kids in LA were beaten up. Some of these guys had driven like 30, 40 miles to come to West Los Angeles to beat these kids up. So only through Facebook they had communicated with each other. So therefore, what you are doing is wonderful. I appreciate it. It's a war of information, and this information has to get out, and constantly people have to get informed. As Hamid mentioned, the Iranian youth have woken up. They are up to date. They are very much advanced, and you check Instagram, you check Twitter, there are thousands of Iranians on it. And but at the same time, regime is not sitting idly by. They have their robots, and they are, they have a lot of sympathetic media in the Western world that tolerates their activities, and they lean sort of leftward. So they, as always, the left has always tolerated the Islamists, and therefore I think as I believe Simon Wiesenthal said something like this: for evil to flourish is for good men or women to be quiet. So I think we need to raise our voices, and that's maybe the only thing we can do.
So to wrap up our session, let's our good woman to raise her voice. Sharon, what do you think we can do in order to help people in the diaspora, Jews and non-Jews, to help the situation in Iran? And I would like to ask you, besides organizing sessions like this or reporting, what can we do?
One of the tools that ADL has used for the century that it's existed, ADL is one of the oldest Jewish American organizations since 1913, is coalition work. So we as Iranians have to find ways to join hands and to work together with others who share the same values as we do. And I think we do that somewhat effectively, but we can definitely do a better job. There are many around the world today who are fighting the same kind of despotic repression that the Islamic Republic has, and who would help us and understand why we in the diaspora have to be on the forefront of calling out the regime, not only for its nuclear stuff, which is obviously existential, not only for the terrorism, which has effects around the world, including in Latin America. Just yesterday, Maziar, the Daniel Ortega in Venezuela was reaffirmed as the president of Venezuela. Who is sitting there next to him? The minister of Iran, who was found guilty and with evidence of having perpetrated a bombing in Argentina that killed
Rezai, who was used to be the Revolutionary Guards commander.
Exactly. So he's sitting in as a guest of honor in Venezuela. So we have to call those out. There is a red alert against him. He had to be arrested once he passed any border, and he was not. So it's on us. It's on us to form coalitions, to hold politicians and institutions responsible, and to call it out when we see acts like yesterday. So I think by joining hands with others, showing that we have shared values, but also being very loud and clear, holding institutions and political leaders responsible for their own responsibilities, which obviously are not happening, but we have to continue to do that.
Right. We're going to cover Ortega's inauguration in Nicaragua and Mohsen Rezai, who was the Revolutionary Guard's commander, presence in that ceremony on IranWire. I would like to thank all of you, Sharon, Hamid, and George, for being here, especially Sharon and George. You woke up so early and you've been so generous with your time. Hamid as well, thank you so much for sharing those memories. I'm sure that it's painful to talk about some of those memories, but I think we just have to talk about it more. Well, thank you so much, our panelists and everyone who's been watching this program live or the recorded version of this that will be on YouTube very soon.